on the other hand, like, he's obviously like basically a cartoon version of an archaeologist. Like,
Yeah.
none of these things actually exist in the form that we see them in these movies, where it's like there's booby traps and you go in and you like if you like push on the right stones, like this thing pops out. It's almost like the artifacts were like waiting for somebody to like come in and like put in the right, combination for the safe and then take them. And like there's almost this feeling that like because Indiana Jones is the one who can figure it out, then like that gives him more ownership to be able to take it, because it was almost like placed there waiting to be taken. Hello and welcome to Cinema of Meaning, the podcast from myself, Thomas Flight, and my fellow video essayist Tom Vanderlinden from the channel Like Stories of Old that seeks to explore the depths of what cinema has to offer. This week on the podcast, we are going to be discussing Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. But before we get into that, I just want to mention this is a Nebula original podcast. There's a few ways you can support the podcast if you want to help us keep it going. One way is to listen on Nebula, where you'll get episodes a week early and without any ads. You can go to nebula.tv/cinema of meaning to sign up. You'll get a discount if you use that code. That'll support the podcast as well. And you'll get access to those early episodes and a bunch of bonus episodes that we've made. So check that out. You can also support our Patreon and get access to our Discord server, where we hang out and discuss upcoming movies and just chat about film in general. Links to that are in the description. For now, let's get into the episode. So it had been a while since I had seen any of these. So in preparation for this, I went back and I watched the final installment of the Last Crusade. And then I also watched The Crystal Skull. And that ended up being like a very interesting contrast. I'm glad I did that, because I think it made the parts about the Crystal Skull that don't feel as strong stick out to me a little bit more, watching those back to back. But there was also some interesting thematic resonance between the two. So yeah, I think this will be a fun discussion. But give me a little rundown of like maybe your relationship to this franchise. Mm-hmm. How did you feel about the Crystal Skull when it came out, and then how did you feel rewatching it now?
Yeah, that's going to be a pretty short story, because I don't really have that much of a connection with Indiana Jones. I feel like it's very much a piece of Americana, at least
true.
Based on like when I started watching like film YouTubers like Chris Stuckman, predominantly him, but like some others too. It felt like to them Indiana Jones was such an essential element of their personal film history, whereas for me here in Europe that wasn't that much the case. I'd seen the first 3 movies, but they would play on cable every now and then, but it weren't like big events or like big cultural things beyond that. And I think I'd even seen the first movie only once, because for some reason they tended to replay the second and the third one more often, at least to my recollection, because I remembered more clearly. I revisited all of them later on, as I obviously saw everyone talking about how much of a big deal these movies really were in terms of like great action and adventure pieces and that sort of stuff. But I remembered much of the second movie, The Temple of Doom, and I also remembered pretty much of the third one. But the first one, the one that started it all, was actually like I didn't remember any of it, basically, to the point where I wasn't even sure if I'd seen it at all when I was young. But yeah, I always enjoyed them. I thought they were fun. Perfect cable rewatch movies when you're 10 years old, even though they're quite violent. And I had the same with the Crystal Skull, where it kind of surprised me. Oh yeah, these movies, they're not like the adventure movies that we have nowadays. They still had like melting faces and people being eaten alive by ants and stuff. and the Temple of Doom had that scene where someone's heart gets ripped out, which I remembered vividly from seeing it when I was a child. But yeah, I actually don't remember when I first saw The Crystal Skull. When year did it came out again? It was
2008, I think. Yeah.
2008. Yeah, so I didn't go into that with a lot of nostalgia or expectations, and from what I can remember, I thought it was fine, nothing. I wasn't attached to it enough to be really offended by it as some others were. Because at the time of its release and for years after, it was, I think people were pretty harsh on it. But I also didn't care too much about it to really dig into it if it was to see if it was deserved or. I guess that's why now is such an interesting time to revisit it, because now we have that, as you said, that kind of second legacy sequel going or coming up, and you already start to see like some people changing their opinion a little bit on the Crystal Skull, or at least doing some revisionism, trying to do some attempt at reappreciation, or at least to give it another opportunity to see like, oh, maybe there was something here, or maybe not, or but yeah, watching it now, I still felt it was mostly fine. I think it still carries the same tropes. It has it was directed by Steven Spielberg, so it does still have that solid like camera work. It has a solid presentation.
Yeah.
I think it does also some interesting things thematically in the way that it kind of reflects a little bit, not as explicitly as I think the next movie will probably do it, but a little bit on the kind of the nature of the treasure hunting film and the implications of basically the way the genre is rooted in kind of these colonial dynamics.
Yeah.
Which, not to immediately say that makes it problematic, but
right.
There are certain dynamics there about the way we treat like the what to us is the foreign world, and the way we treat like stories of adventure into that world. And I think this movie does try to steer a little bit more sensitively into
there's sort
those
of
dynamics, but
an implicit update on those themes, in the sense that it's about like returning an artifact to a location.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
There's a slightly different sensibility in how it engages with that, but then you still get to those places and have like some, like what is coded as like savages, like running out and screaming, and they're kind of nameless and faceless. So it like there's an interesting like, it's engaging with those ideas a little bit, but it obviously can't like leave them entirely behind, just because I think the nature of the franchise like is almost too steeped in it. But that's one thing I'd be very interested to see, how like 2008 was still pretty early on in like kind of some of the like rising mainstream cultural awareness of some of these issues, at least in like, Hollywood, America. So I think it would be very interesting to see what like a 2023 version of Indiana Jones looks like. I expect we'll probably see a little bit more explicit engagement with some of those themes.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think the Crystal Skull also, besides the things that you mentioned, it also has that somewhat outdated trope where the alien civilization was actually the facilitator of ancient human civilizations, which I don't know, it's kind of, I wouldn't say I'm not sure if it's like rooted in racism, or more like a sort of can you be like racist towards the past?
Yeah.
But that's this kind of thing where we tend to assume that technological and just like knowledge has a certain linear progression that we are now at the peak of.
Yeah.
Which denies, I think, a lot of the ingenuity and the resourcefulness and the just the wisdom and even like technical know-how that a lot of more ancient civilizations had, including our own, like our own direct ancestors that have actually been lost with time. So there's actually, as much as technology has been growing, there has also been a loss of knowledge in other areas. And to therefore look back and say, or look at all the things that we were able to do, or that people used to be able to do, that we now no longer know how they were done, and say, oh, it's probably aliens or something. That's there is a certain denial there or a certain dismissal of the value of those cultures and of our own past, essentially. Which has become a bit of a trope in these kinds of stories, and which is not something that I think is really fair because it does kind of perpetuate that worldview that progress is this linear line, and that this kind of negotiation between information that is gained and information that is lost. And so yeah.
Well, that especially, the idea of like knowledge and some of that, like whether or not it's good, as a whole, or like, I don't know. We'll get into that because this movie is going into interesting territory towards the end with that as well. So, but I think we should maybe hit some of the more basic stuff before we dive too deep into.
What was your relation to Indiana Jones?
I also don't have a super nostalgic attachment to this.
Did you dress up as Indy when you were young?
No, I would have loved, like, if I had been able to watch these movies like as a really young kid, even though they probably would have, been a little spooky to me or a little scary. I would have loved the adventure aspect of it. But mostly, like, I kind of came to them later as a teenager and watched them like late at night at sleepovers while I was like half falling asleep. So kind of similar to you, it wasn't until kind of later in my adulthood that I evaluated them more kind of as filmmaking objects, or like tried to appreciate them for sort of the filmmaking itself. So yeah, I don't have that super strong nostalgic attachment that some people have as well, which is, I guess just for people who are listening to this who might, apologies, we're not coming from that context, so we might, but that does inform how people come at this. I was looking back at some of the reviews of Crystal Skull just to try to like refresh my my understanding of like how it was received at the time, and you can see two ways in the reviews where the nostalgia really, I think, like affects people's view. And one was people having an overly harsh reaction where it's just like, oh, they violated some kind of like thing that I feel is essential to this like story or these characters or this IP.
And sacredness.
Yeah, and therefore it's garbage. Or the other thing is, there was a lot of people who were like, it's not a good movie, but at least we're getting another Indiana Jones. And like, they're just happy to like see these characters again. And that's another way I think nostalgia informs a sequel like this too, where, sometimes you're like, was it that good? I don't know. But like, it was fun anyway, just to like see, Harrison Ford run around and put on the hat and use the whip and et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know. I think that was just something I noticed that I think is interesting in how like nostalgia can like push reception of a film almost into two different directions at once.
Yeah, I think there's also just this sort of inherent undercurrent of melancholy in a lot of these early legacy sequels, where it's we talked about this in the episode on Scream 5, Scream 6,
Scream 6.
Where were we at with that one? Yeah. Scream 6, where you had the sort of first wave of legacy sequels, which included Scream 4, maybe Rocky Balboa, Rambo, maybe Die Hard 4, and I think then Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, which I think were at this time more defined by also having the old creators come back. It was more of a sort of like one more like final round for your classic beloved heroes. So they were more focused on, like, I think in all of those movies there's at least one joke of how the main protagonist, in this case Indiana Jones, is now an old man and not who he used to be, which kind of infuses these stories with that inherent meta-ness, like, oh, you remember him from when he was young, now he's sad and old, you know. Even though he's not as sad as he I think there's a movie like Logan came out later, but I think Logan kind of embodies this first wave of legacy sequels, in the sense that it's very much centered on the old and aging hero who is kind of on his way out and reflecting on that. But even though that movie kind of cheated because it came out like 2 years after the previous one, in which he was still in his prime, so to say. And then came the second wave of legacy sequels, was more, I think, almost pretty much kicked off by The Force Awakens, where it was more of this, we now have a new generation of filmmakers who were fans of the original works, and they are now giving it a truly like new, refreshing take, or like they're truly like rebooting it for a new audience, where legacy sequels can, or legacy characters can come back, but mostly in support of like a new cast who is truly like being established as now the main characters. I'm not sure if that's going to happen in Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, but I'm guessing there's going to be a little bit more of that than in the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, because even here, like, there's Shia LaBeouf as Mutt, who is later revealed to be Indy's son, which kind of has that element like, oh, we're passing on the torch, like there's a new adventurer coming up, but then in the end it's still very much Indy's story, at least in this movie.
Yeah, they almost use that as like a twist, like a kind of deconstruction of that element, where at the end there's literally a moment where like the hat blows up to Mutt, and it's like he goes to put it on, and Indy kind of swipes it from him, and it's like, no, not yet, at least.
Yeah. And then Shia got into trouble, and then it was never again.
Yes. I do wonder if Shia hadn't essentially like had the trajectory that he has had, if we may have actually gotten, like, instead of the new legacy sequel that we're getting now with Harrison Ford yet again, we would have gotten like, a Shia reboot or something. Or maybe just Shia would have been back. I'm assuming they just write him out of this new film in some way. But because he's not in it as far as I'm aware. But yeah, it's interesting to think about how that might have affected things. But
yeah, either way, I think that's how there's the kind of nostalgia also kind of seeps into that more, into a kind of meta textualness that I think some people just don't enjoy. I know that you do, but for me less so generally. But I think that was the issue with a lot of these early legacy sequels, is that there was just no way of avoiding having to remind people like, oh, your heroes are aging, and so are you.
In this one, I feel like Harrison Ford almost hasn't aged. I didn't feel this play out in real time. So if I had watched the originals as they were coming out and then seen this one in 2008 with the gap in between, maybe I would have felt differently. But like looking back on them now in sequence, Harrison Ford almost isn't quite old enough in the Crystal Skull for it to be that interesting. Like, to me, the meta element of this like tired old man coming back is more present in an interesting way, even in The Force Awakens and in Blade Runner 2049, where you can almost like feel this like heaviness to the character that is brought by like Harrison Ford's age, I think, to some extent. And I mean, he's an actor, so he's doing it on purpose too. But there's a weight there and a tiredness that informs the character, and we kind of get a little bit of that here, but it's not as profound as, I guess, now having seen something like The Force Awakens, where it feels there. Like you're like,
Mm.
oh, this guy is weathered.
I actually like that about the Crystal Skull, because I don't think it's supposed to be a movie or a franchise that's supposed to come with that kind of heavy-handedness and that kind of wariness. And I think it's also in the nature of Indy's character that he's, because in the Star Wars he was this smuggling adventurer who naturally runs into issues when he grows older. But Indiana Jones is also this college professor. He's someone who chases knowledge, which is something that, a type of character that should be able to age more gracefully and more someone who would actually like acquire more peace of mind over the years. And I like that you kind of see that he's still proactive, he's still engaged in the university that he's working, he's still doing his adventures, even though he's maybe a little bit older now, but it definitely doesn't come back a lot in the actual action when you still see him whipping around or swinging around with the whip and stuff and doing all these pretty crazy stunts, surviving a nuclear blast and whatnot. And
yes,
the movie does test your suspension of disbelief, I think,
a little bit
more than the original ones did, but which is also what I think a lot of people maybe held against it, that it's always been there's always been this element of silly adventure, but this one, it's kind of pushing the boundaries of that and pushing the boundaries of the believability to a point where I think for some people it was just too much.
I was thinking about that a lot, and this brings me to my primary gripe with this film, which I won't linger on too long, but I want to mention, which is not, I don't think is original. I think it's the main gripe that a lot of people had with it. But yeah, I was thinking about that a lot, especially watching The Last Crusade back to back with this one, where it's like the original trilogy was in its own way over the top and kind of ridiculous, and like these silly things would happen where it's like, oh yeah, there's no way that would be possible. So like, it's not that outside the realm of feasibility. Some of the, like, it kind of fits in a sense, but it does violate some sort of instinctual, at least for me, it feels less believable. And I think a lot of that has to do with the main issue here, I think, which is like, for me, the CGI. And it's there's something about the constraint of having to do things more or less practically to some extent, that Spielberg would have had in the first three, that like imbues a certain charm into some of, there's like a charm and a playfulness, but also a tangibility in some of the like action set pieces, even when they're ridiculous. And this is in line with things we've talked about a little bit, I think, in like our Jurassic Park discussion or whatever. But it's like you can look at some of the practical effects and you're like, it's fake, but like you can also tell that like the actors are like actually doing something. They're like grabbing onto a real thing or like moving across something that feels very real. And so even though okay, that's ridiculous, you couldn't actually like make this jump onto a tank and then like do this crazy thing or whatever, like some part of your brain is still kind of tricked by like the sort of visible tangibility of it. And then there's two things that happen when you move into a movie like this and you shift to a lot of CGI stuff, where the first being you lose that tangibility and things are kind of noticeably fake in a slightly different way. And then the other thing that happens is, I think because you're using CGI instead of practical effects, there's sort of this like larger scale of possibility. And so like there's this tendency among filmmakers, I think, to want to like ramp up the size of the set pieces, and that does not necessarily like make for better, more interesting stuff. And so like instead of like a more contained set piece that you could have done practically, where, you know, this tank is crashing off a cliff and you just have to jump off of it at the right time, you have a bit where like a boat is falling into a tree and then down into a thing, and you're going down waterfall after waterfall, and it just like it stretches like too far the like capacity to be like on board with sort of the the believability.
I think it also just contradicts the internal logic of the story that's
right
being set up, because I think originally, like in the first Indiana Jones, it had like the Ark of the Covenant, it had like very sci-fi science fiction elements at the end of it, but for some reason nobody saw that and was like, oh, it's no longer believable, because it's established like this is a world where magic does in fact exist, or there are these magical artifacts that have ancient powers or religious powers or whatever. So it is a world with magic, but at the same time, Indiana Jones was also established as a very much any ordinary person who had the same physical limits and capabilities mostly as any ordinary man. And then when you get to a movie like this, where you have him surviving a nuclear blast and then having him go down not one waterfall but like two more, with each being increasingly more intense than the last, it just it also kind of it just strips away from that direct relatability to the relatability to the characters and the believability of their internal logic, or sort of.
I don't think we should linger here too long, because this is probably the most like discussed portion of this movie. But two things I want to say before we move on, which is, you already kind of mentioned it, but I still really appreciate the Steven Spielberg's ability to like construct, like it does reveal, looking at something like this does reveal the benefit still of having someone who really understands like visually how to move the camera and construct a scene, even when you're like too much CGI. Like there's still a artfulness with how he's portraying it that I don't see in a lot of like other more contemporary like CGI spectacle films, that I really appreciate. So and
I think there's also still more practical stuff here than people give it credit for, I think, especially if you compare it to newer movies where like entire scenes will be CGI. Here you can kind of see like, oh, this is all CGI, but this little bit, that's real. And that weirdly made me appreciate the realness also a little bit more, even though it kind of stands in that stark contrast with the part of the screen that's obviously fake. But,
right. Yeah. I think where that hurts, I think where the CGI hurts it the most is like in the action set pieces. So like where that scene where they're driving through the jungle and they're just like, you know, Shia LaBeouf's sword fighting Cate Blanchett and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It like that scene to me, I'm just like, okay, you know, cool. It has none of the excitement of, for example, like, you know, young Indy like running over it and like the chase across the train at the beginning of the Last Crusade, or like other car chases. I think the one at the beginning of the very Raiders of the Lost Ark, there's like there's such like a that tangibility there in those moments really impacts how the scene feels to me, at least when it's like one where they're like going through a cave a little bit or like a fake environment, and you can tell like, oh, there's some CGI thrown in here to like spruce up the set a little bit. Then it doesn't bother me too much, because it's you know, it doesn't impact sort of the visceral excitement of, oh, this action feels real, or like the stakes feel real in a certain way. So anyway, we can move on to more interesting.
Yeah. The one last thing I forgot to mention earlier is that when I was talking about this being established as a universe with magical stuff,
Right.
For me, that's also why I actually don't mind the inclusion of aliens at the end of Crystal Skull. Like, I feel like a lot of people complained about that, but I feel like that's more in line with the
Right.
original works um, than people generally give the credit for. In my
Yeah.
opinion, that is.
One of the tropes of the series is kind of like that the thing he's looking for and the magic of it is a little bit real
Yeah,
or
yeah,
is real, within the context of the story. So that doesn't feel like um a violation to me.
yeah,
Although there's
yeah.
a distinct shift, and this would be interesting to talk about, from like a mythology, exploring mythologies that are rooted in the past and history, to one that it has more of like a futuristic weighting. Um, and there's something about like maybe the sensibility from, whenever the last one was released in the 80s to 2008, where there's a shift of perspective there.
But how do you mean a future
Like,
perspective? Or
well, you go from so you watch the old one and it's like,
Mhm.
oh, there's this artifact from the past that is maybe a little bit magical, but that magic is rooted in like the possibility of the realness of some kind of ancient religion or philosophy or whatever it is, or
Yeah, yeah,
artifact or magic that's in the past. And then there's this shift almost to this more like modernist sensibility in the 2008 one, where it's like, yeah, we're still like looking for these artifacts that are in the past, but they're informed specifically by like I almost wonder if like aliens feel more conceivable as like a possibility for the origin of magic now than like a traditional religion or something like that, which might have felt, I don't know, maybe people in the 80s were like, whatever. But I don't know if there's just something about the cultural shift.
yeah,
It's just interesting to me that you have this like gap in time, and then you come back and it shifts from, real magic in the past to real magic in the future. Like, aliens aren't
yeah,
necessarily, I mean, they feel more like, I think they feel more plausible to a lot of people now, because they're like, oh, that old stuff isn't real. But we don't like, it's not like we have any scientific indication that something like what is depicted in this film is any more real than like a holy grail
yeah.
necessarily. Um, it just feels, more plausible within our current worldview framework as a culture.
Yeah, it's a more secular approach, I guess, than a religious one would be, or as the ones, the
Right,
original
right.
ones did. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess that might also be a good segue into the thematic stuff about what the aliens represent, how the story comments on its own, the other earlier tropes, that sort of stuff. I'm not sure to what extent this is really thematically relevant, but that's obviously the historical transition from a World War II setting to a more Cold War setting, which is very firmly established. Like, it's not just background, it's like very much at the foreground, where you have this evil Russian played by Kate Blanchett, who's out to find this crystal skull for some kind of psycho warfare, telepathy. I'm not sure exactly what her idea was, but
A big weapon,
a big weapon.
which
But
I
a
think is
weapon of
relevant.
the mind, not a
Right,
weapon of, like, not a nuclear weapon,
right.
more of a, which I guess kind of plays into that whole Red Scare and the idea that the Russians aren't just gonna throw bombs, but they're going to like infect the brain and the mind and the spirit and that sort of stuff. Um, I guess it's kind of maybe I think that Spielberg may have been doing that a little bit tongue in cheek, where it kind of
Right, yeah.
sort of jokingly looks back now on how ridiculous that whole Red Scare was. I'm not sure that it was, but I'm guessing that it was at least a little bit.
I
Do
think
you think that carries any important significance, the Cold War setting for this
I,
story?
well, I got watching it again, I got a little bit excited because I think talking about this might make a nice little unofficial prologue to our Cinema of Nuclear Dread series that we're going to be doing leading up to Oppenheimer. So we'll be discussing Doctor Strangelove, then some other films, and then discussing Oppenheimer ultimately. So we'll be doing that soon. And if you want to get access to those like early in time for Oppenheimer, you can listen on Nebula. But I got a little bit excited watching this when I saw some of this stuff coming up, and I was like, oh, this is gonna, this will be like feed into our thematic discussion of nuclear dread. But then it just kind of sets it as some context and then just kind of drops it. It didn't feel like it really went anywhere with that. It's maybe returning to it a little bit at the end where like maybe it's saying, Kate Blanchett's character at the end is like, I want to know everything. And there's some like weird connection between like the search for all knowledge and creating, like weaponry that is too powerful. There's maybe some vague allusion to those things. But ultimately, I didn't really feel like it engaged with that material.
No. There's a little bit of a callback there, I think, to the Ark of the Covenant and the idea of humans being too grandiose and wanting to deal with forces that are beyond their capability, which in that movie came more in this religious context, but here it seemed, it came more from maybe that kind of nuclear, Cold War-ish perspective, even though, as you pointed out, there's some friction there between what is really suggested at the end. Like, is it about knowledge? Is it about knowing everything and that being too much? Or is it about meddling with these literal forces of nature that lead to literal destruction, which I think was kind of poorly communicated. But I guess that's also not really what people are going to see Indiana Jones for a very deep thematic journey into human hubris.
It's not like the old ones had like super deep explorations of like the nature of fascism or something like that. There was always kind of a backdrop, I think, for the adventure.
Yeah, because I guess that's what the main thematic content is, kind of the nature of adventure, and which in itself has become a little bit contentious due to more like voices from the global south or voices from the places that where the lost arks are that were raided by Indiana Jones types characters. So yeah, what do you think of that in general? The way, how would you summarize like the critique on adventure movies and treasure hunting, and how do you relate to that personally? Like, does it affect the way you approach these movies, or can you still enjoy them with the additional context in mind, or how do you go about this?
I can still mostly enjoy them and appreciate them, although, I'm coming from the context that isn't really being offended in this case. So, I can only speak for myself. But I do, there is just kind of inherently like a sort of colonialist, there is like a colonialist like perspective or context to even kind of the setup and framing of these stories. I think it's interesting to see how sort of in the original trilogy, Indy's cast he's shown in light against the villains are always the ones who like, they want the artifact for its power, for what it will give them, monetarily, or it's going to give them some kind of ability, or they can, harness it in some way for their own goals. And Indy is shown as being the one who has more of this pure, like in the eyes of the movie, this pure ideology of like, it belongs in a museum is this thing that he says, like, oh, that should go in a museum. I'm just here to like with a respect for the past and for history and like these things. But now that's, that perspective has, I think for good reason, been pretty heavily critiqued, because it's like that is such a sort of Euro, Western, first world centric view of like, oh, we're going to go to another place and sort of rescue these artifacts of the past and then like bring them back to where we hold them. And there's a lot of work that's currently being done to kind of like reevaluate like literally stuff in museums all over the world, or in the first world, not all over the world, with the goal of making them potentially be more all over the world, or returning some of these kind of to the ownership of, the people who they were taken from or stolen from. Yeah. We talked in our Wind River episode about sort of the relationship between the Native American peoples in America, in the United States, and the government there. And there's a big effort right now to like return a lot of artifacts and things that have been taken from, where they were found, or, placed in United States museums or private collections or whatever, to the people who they would have originally belonged to, and allowing them to decide what they want to do with them. And I think like a lot of that all makes sense to me. I think, it's a weird position to like essentially like claim you have some kind of ownership of something on the basis of like, we're trying to collect knowledge about the past, and therefore that gives me sort of the right to go like take it for myself. So yeah, that's kind of the context in which like Indiana Jones exists as like this adventurer who's going to go like grab this artifact. But also it's like, it's a fake, like it's also, so, on one hand that, and I think those critiques are fair. On the other hand, like, he's obviously like basically a cartoon version of an archaeologist. Like none of these things actually exist in the form that we see them in these movies, where it's like there's booby traps and you go in and you like if you like push on the right stones, like this thing pops out. It's almost like the artifacts were like waiting for somebody to like come in and like put in the right, combination for the safe and then take them. And like, there's almost this feeling that like, because Indiana Jones is the one who can figure it out, then like that gives him more ownership to be able to take it, because it was almost like placed there waiting to be taken. I don't know. So there's something weird about that in the framework of the movie too. How do you feel about this stuff?
Yeah, I find it interesting. I can obviously not speak to what this means to people who live in the global south or in the countries that we tell these kinds of stories about, and make up for these kind of like mythologies for our own entertainment. But I find it more interesting from a purely white perspective, I guess, and the idea of the losing a myth that we found valuable or found entertaining in the past, because that's kind of what's happening from our perspective. Like we are kind of forced to reevaluate a part of ourselves and a part of our, not just of what we find entertaining, but also kind of the underlying worldview that it hints at, which in this case is, as you said, like the idea that stuff in ancient tombs halfway around the world are fair game, that it's ours for the taking, and that we cannot even conceive of letting things like that just be, that we just have this natural, or at least I guess it's not natural, but like this cultural instinct to go scour the world for these hidden treasures and interesting little things. And I'm not sure, I guess there's some part of that which is, I find it I always find it hard to separate that, the kind of the cultural aspect of that, from the more instinctive human urge to just desire adventures
Right.
and just to want to go. I think people have a natural curiosity to unfamiliar places, and from our perspective, like a lot of the global south are unfamiliar places. Like for me, I'd even say like for a long time the United States for me I was just as exotic as South America or something to me, even though later I realized obviously there's more connections that I have with
Right.
West or the United States culture than with maybe South American ones. Um, but still, yeah, it's hard to kind of navigate that balance between to what extent can you enjoy, a sort of neutral or benign kind of exoticism, like just enjoying
Right.
something new, enjoying strange new worlds, or in real life or in fiction. And to what extent does that become, or where does that become, uh, more of that invasive thing for
Right.
people who already live in those places that you then venture into as a tourist or
Yeah.
as a treasure hunter or whatever. So yeah, that's something that I find interesting. I'm not sure what the best, like if I had to tell a story like Indiana Jones, like I'm not sure what the right approach would be, other than to maybe, what you can see in like Black Panther, like just hand it off completely to someone,
Right.
to a character from that culture who's coming to ours to take something back. But then that would kind of lose that aspect of adventure, because then to us it really becomes a story about purely on the kind of the colonial aspect of it, and not so much the adventure, because I feel like there is something about these kind of movies that demand foreign places, and
Right.
if you make movies in the United States yet, then it's hard to kind of flip that premise around and have the United States be the place that's foreign to the main character, and or for Europe, for that matter.
That's why we have to make movies about space now.
Yeah.
I thought about the movie not Alien, is it Covenant? Which one? Prometheus. A couple times watching this one. For various reasons. But
that is pretty much a sort of treasure hunt movie,
yeah.
But then it's kind of like it sidesteps the whole issue by kind of presenting like this story where it's strange new foreign land with ancient civilization, but not one that you really have to care about,
It's technically us in the future, or there's some kind of like, there's not a. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I was thinking about this, and like the whole construct of like adventure to begin with, and I think like kind of one of the critiques of, this is something we've talked about before, you've discussed on your channel, but like, how do we frame sort of like the call to adventure? How do we frame, adventure as something that isn't colonial, that doesn't like have, that doesn't cast necessarily like an outside enemy. When like, not that we can never have enemies, but I think it's interesting how like a lot of these frameworks about how we approach the world as sort of a hero kind of involve, structuring the story, the narrative in a certain way, where it's like we exist in a place that's familiar to us. There's unknown stuff out there, and you go into that world, and it's kind of hostile. Maybe there are good examples. This is something I'd love to hear from our listeners. You can let us know in our Discord, or on Twitter or something. If you can think of any good examples that like model sort of an adventure story and sort of this traditional structure, but in a way that is sort of like has a respect for sort of the territory that it's going into, instead of more of like a adversarial
It doesn't. I don't think it has to be adversarial necessarily. I think it just uh, more basically it has a exploited civilization or a
Right.
civilization that is to be exploited. There's
Yes.
something,
Yes.
some other that functions as, or some other that contains something that we can then extract from
Yes.
that culture or civilization or whatever.
Yeah.
Even if they're not being hostile about it towards us, we still
Right.
then want to go in and take it for some reason.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting discussion. I don't have good answers for it. I think people are working to just be better and more sensitive about these things by shifting the context, by actually, if you're going to tell a story where you go to a place, actually represent people from that place. That's a good kind of first step.
That's something that I was actually missing in Crystal Skull a little bit. I think because it was even less there than some of the previous Indiana Jones movies, where I felt like there was never a moment where we were in like the foreign city with the local people, or I felt like it were all these more nebulous jungle area or now this kind of place. It was never like a true sense of place for. It didn't feel like there were actually any other cultures really represented in this movie.
It almost went the Top Gun Maverick route of like trying to avoid being problematic by just making it as nameless and faceless as possible, and then just creating like an avatar of another.
But to me, that also actually detracted a little bit from the sense of exoticism that the enjoyable kind, where it's fun, like to explore like a new city or new culture, or get to see like how different people live on film, which can be very interesting and at least to me is always fascinating, especially when that then is presented with some kind of accuracy, like I don't know, Lawrence of Arabia for example, which was really like shot on location, and I think the first Indiana Jones also had plenty of scenes that were actually set in like these Middle Eastern cities. I don't remember exactly where it all took place, but North African maybe. But it felt like the story went places in a way that the Crystal Skull doesn't really do, and that it actually becomes, as you said, like more culturally empty almost, in a way that also detracts from the whole the bigger experience of adventure, at least for me.
Yeah. There's a needle to thread there between like sensitivity and representation and not like culturally appropriating or exploiting a culture, and then also just like being like, well, we're just not gonna represent or show any culture other than our own in movies ever. Like that's obviously to me seems obviously like also the wrong like way to approach the situation. But it's complicated, I guess.
It's difficult because it feels like it's a critique that if you take it too far, it also kind of undermines the whole point of its own story. Like if you have this adventure story and you also critique it all the way and kind of fill it with white guilt to the point where it doesn't become enjoyable at all, then why then even make the movie, unless you specifically want to point out just the anti-colonialism of it all. But I'm guessing there's more interesting ways to do that than just making a sort of cynical adventure movie that's almost blaming you for wanting to go in and enjoy it.
I will say, in the context of Indiana Jones, like especially the most recent two movies, I think, as much as some of the things we've discussed are there's also this element of like pulling back from that a little bit, in the sense that part of the trope is there's also these bad guys who are after this thing. So Indiana Jones kind of is going in there to sort of like prevent them from doing something bad with the thing, which does, I feel like, pull back from this, like he's just going in for his own gain. And then there's also the shift we see in The Last Crusade, where it's kind of like this whole thematic like movement of that movie is sort of like let it go. Like by the end, you're just like letting the grail just sort of go. You're not becoming attached to like needing this thing. And then by the time we get to the crystal skull, it's like we're trying to take this thing and like put it back in the place that it came from, instead of like, hoarding it for a museum or whatever. So I think there is sort of this like thematic progression there where we see, Indy as a character isn't himself, as much as he's engaging in this activity that like contextually is rooted in like this colonialist activity of archaeology. He himself as a character is not motivated on the page or on the screen by by those more negative elements that I think we're talking about.
He's not directly or explicitly malicious, but he is, I think maybe in the beginning, like maybe just implicitly so, or like in a benign way where it's like he has the genuine appreciation for the artifact, but he still wants to take it and bring it along to his own museum instead of just truly let it exist where it is, which I think that I wonder to what extent there's some cultural cultural artifact there about why we have such a strong desire to just want to have things and want to capture things in some way, whether it's like knowledge or like these concrete weird artifacts from these hidden temples or whatever. I'm not sure to what extent that's a thing in other cultures that aren't, historically speaking, haven't been like engaged in these colonial practices and were more, at least I'm guessing here, maybe a little bit more content than we are with the world around them as it is, without feeling the need to kind of take it all in and like organize it in a way that we find satisfactory and that we the way in we see it, so to say. I think the what you pointed out is a good path, or at least some progression towards something that's more restorative even, instead of exploitative. But I'm not sure how it's for me. I find it such a difficult genre to quote unquote fix in that sense, because it
right
because in the essence of it's, the whole puzzle and the secret artifact and going in and avoiding like the arrows shooting out of the walls and then taking the things and having like your little treasure, like it's so ingrained in the genre as being part of the fun and being part of the kind of escapist fantasy of adventure, that it's hard to really find a way around that, I think, without just doing away with the genre entirely, or doing away with that story structure entirely.
You kind of have it in movies like National Treasure or like the Da Vinci Code, where it's like the thing the adventurer is exploring is sort of their own history or their own past or their own, it's not colonial in the sense that it's going back in on itself. The problem is those movies aren't as good in terms of filmmaking, or
I really liked the first National Treasure when it was young.
They're fun.
I've seen it like dozens of times.
It's been a long time since I've seen that one, so maybe it's better than I'm remembering. They're not terrible, but
I'm not sure it is, but
I don't think anyone would rank them like on the level of like the best Indiana Jones movies. I just mean in the sense of like they're not Steven Spielberg movies that are highly regarded and really well crafted and shot. But
National Treasure in that sense was an interesting example of a movie that really dove into its own history and made that as exciting as going to some distant temple from a culture that nobody knows. In some ways even more interesting, because it also then reframes the familiar, or it kind of dives into your own history. And I guess we see the same with the Da Vinci Code, but more for Europeans. because I think National Treasure, that one took entirely took place in the United States, I think.
I think so.
Yeah. So I guess it can be done it can be made interesting on
right.
just like the home front. Yeah. So it's like
you could do like a heist movie where indigenous people like raid the British National Museum and take back. That's one way you could do it. I guess that's what something like, How to Blow Up. I haven't seen How to Blow Up a Pipeline, but that's more of like a progressive, maybe leftist sort of context for sort of like an adventure that has some element. But then like anything you do that with is going to garner some type of more controversial stance. I don't know. It'll be interesting. I'll be interested to see what the new Indiana Jones does. And my guess is if it engages with these topics we've been discussing in any kind of interesting way, people will be like, oh no, Indiana Jones is woke now. So we'll see. See what happens. One thing I wanted to talk about before we wrap up is kind of the I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but I found it interesting, was like the personal story that's happening in this movie. Indy is getting back together with Marion. He has a son. There's like this familial drama that kind of echoes The Last Crusade, where he's sort of like, reconnecting with his dad, and there's all this tension there. And I don't have much to say about that, except watching these with the context of, and I'm not the only person that said this. I think David Singer is his name, the film critic, wrote something about this. But watching these now with the context of the Fabelmans and looking back on this like familial text and subtext that's in Spielberg's movies, gives it to me like a little bit more weight, where it's like it's a little bit more interesting because you can see how personal maybe this stuff was to him that he was putting in there. It's not just like, oh, I'm going to spice up a little drama by like throwing in some themes about, family. Like the themes about family that is being is thrown into these movies are, we now know, like based on the Fabelmans, like pretty relevant to stuff that Spielberg has dealt with in his life. But I just find that interesting that like embedded in the midst of these crazy madcap adventures are these like the most poignant emotional moments of the film center around these issues that ultimately were very relevant to Spielberg, which, I guess they say write what you know, so that's a good way to do it. But I found that interesting.
I don't have many thoughts on that, except for that one thing I did like is that once Indy finds out that Mutt is actually his son, he's not like, oh, I don't want it. But instead he's like immediately takes on this father role and immediately becomes like this overbearing character to this person who he has known for just like 5 days at this point. Which I thought was kind of fun and an interesting subversion of the how that usually goes, where there's that phase of rejection and denial. And I like the way how he just straight up embraced it and went with it, I guess. The two things that really stood out to me were kind of like Mutt's theme of like not being involved in school, and Indy's relative supportiveness of that is like directly a reflection of Spielberg wanting to leave school in order to pursue filmmaking. And then there's also a moment where right before the hat blows into Mutt, and then he like doesn't put it on because Indy takes it. He's filming the wedding, which is like feels like a very personal. Spielberg is already like inserting some little notes about his own life into these. The dynamic between Mutt and Indy, ultimately though, I found wasn't quite as funny as all the bits between his dad and in the previous episode or the previous film.
It's just TV at this point.
Spielberg Extended Universe.
Tune in soon for the next episode of the Indiana Jones show. It's been a long time coming, but
yeah. But yeah, I agree. I felt like the Mutt-Indy relation was serviceable at best.
Yeah.
It had some fun moments. That's also where like classic Spielberg comes in, where they meet at the diner and then they start this fight, and immediately it's like the greasers versus the jocks. And I like the way he kind of he went a little bit musical with it almost.
Yeah.
You know, at least it felt like a bit of West Side Story-ish. But yeah, that sort of stuff like that reminded me, oh yeah, this is definitely a Steven Spielberg movie and not a modern one. Like that's the kind of stuff that we don't really see anymore nowadays. Maybe until next week, until when the next Indiana Jones comes out. But
right.
I'm not sure to what extent it will dare to lean into that kind of cheesiness. But yeah, I guess we'll see.
We will find out. All right. Well, thanks everybody for listening. If you want to catch the next episode right now, you can listen to that on Nebula. Just go to cinemaofmeaning.tv/Nebula. Link is in the description below. You can also check out our Patreon, where you can join our Discord. Tell us how upset you are that we ruined your beloved Indiana Jones by talking about how he's a colonialist. Apologies. But yeah, you can do that in our Discord. The link is in the description below. And we will catch you next time.